What do you really know about your investments and your financial advisor? Gary Cinderbrandt, a veteran advisor and founder of Better Path Training, has spent decades helping both financial advisors and their clients get it right when it matters most. Gary pulls back the curtain on the advisory world to reveal the truths, the gaps, and the opportunities that most people never hear about, but absolutely should. It's about more than money. It's about legacy, trust, and making sure the people you care about are in the right hands. Welcome to If the Public Only Knew. Now here's your host, Gary Cinderbrandt.
This is Gary Cinderbrandt. Welcome back to If the Public Only Knew. Pretty excited about today's guest. I'm always excited when I get to learn things I just literally knew nothing about until I started doing research on our guest today, Dan Kurzrock. Dan is the co-founder, I believe, of Upcycled Food. A fascinating story. And I would say that during my period of time, Dan, of just researching what you were up to, my eyes were wide open going, I never knew any of that. One of the things you mentioned, it might be a good place to start, and maybe we can figure out how the definition between paradox and irony comes in, is the amount of hunger in the world versus the amount of food waste, and how from your start in your college dorm room, you worked from there to frankly being able to come up with a logical potential solution for one of the biggest problems the world faces. So anyway, Dan, welcome. Tell me what you're doing.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Gary, and thanks to anyone, everyone who's tuning in here today. And just delighted to share a bit more of our story, which is rooted in a mission, as you alluded to, Gary. And so our company, Upcycled Foods Inc., what we're all about is finding overlooked nutrition that's being left off the table, because frankly our food system is quite efficient at some things, but quite inefficient. Big picture. So most estimates have our food system at something like 30 to 40% waste. So it's kind of like going to the grocery store with five, leaving 5 bags of groceries and dropping 2 in the parking lot and being okay with that. And that's measuring everything from spoilage at the grocery store to food waste at home, and also farm level losses and the like. And what it tends to not be so good at measuring, which kind of makes that denominator of what we're wasting as a system a lot more staggering, is a bit of a technicality between this idea of food waste and food loss, and what we're actually measuring as food to begin with. And from my perspective, maybe I'll start by sharing a little bit of our story as to how our eyes got open to this. It was from actually making beer, and in the beer making process, using about 1 pound of grain to make every 6-pack of beer. And from the beer making process, just extracting the sugars from the beer for fermentation of the beverage. But what's left behind is fiber and protein. Now, is that food? If we're not preparing it to be food, or if we're using it as a byproduct or a co-product of the beer production process, right? That's 1 pound of grain for every 6-pack of beer. That adds up to, in the US alone, about 20 billion pounds per annum of this barley, really high quality barley that's been produced and so-called used for one initial purpose, but it actually has a lot more to offer. And so what we've done is figured out a way to close the loop on that, so to speak. And our first innovation on this was creating a new ingredient made from this barley. We call it Regrain SuperGrain Plus, and it looks like an alternative flour, for example, that could be used in bread products that are available nationally now, for example. And so you open with this really important question of kind of that intersection, or maybe the dissonance between the fact that we have a food system that's wasting so much food, and then we have so much hunger also that's happening. And it's hard to accept that these two things are connected, or happening at the same time, I should say. But because food waste does not cause hunger, of course. But we often find ourselves thinking, where are there opportunities to reduce, food waste, make for a more efficient food system, and make that food accessible, make that nutrition accessible to more people. And we need all the solutions, and we think that what we're working on is one aspect of what would build a more resilient and just food system for all, where we improve the way that we value the resources that support life on our home planet.
Hard to argue with. Let me take you back a little bit, because the sense I get is that, first of all, I want to understand how you figured out how to brew beer in college in the first place. Did you go to school to learn how to be a brewer?
No, but I did, I guess you could say necessity being the mother invention of some cases here, because there's a fun loophole, which is that it's perfectly legal to buy the ingredients and equipment to make beer. And so when one of my best friends, my roommate freshman year of college, came home from winter break with some equipment from his uncle and an idea that we start, basically making, beer in a bathtub. I thought that sounded like a lot of fun. I've always been interested in how things are made, and it was quite a fun hobby, honestly. The first couple batches went well, and we at one point we were making beer every week. We made sure we didn't have class on Fridays so that we could make beer. And the original idea came from this just experience of making the beer ourselves, and handling this really high quality grain, and smelling it, and even tasting it as it comes out of what's called the mash tun, where it looks like a large serving of oatmeal. Effectively, it's barley, not oats, but it's hot grains that are you've done this soaking step with, and then being in an environment where the only place to dispose of it was a dumpster, because we were in an urban environment. I grew up in Northern California, where we had a vegetable garden in the backyard and a compost pile. And if I, had been learning how to brew beer in that environment, maybe I would have never come up with the idea, but I felt like I was physically wasting food every time I was making beer. And so I had the idea to see if I could make something with that grain, and then actually market it to friends and people who are on campus. And, I wasn't super altruistic in the beginning, Gary, I'll be honest with you. I just was hoping to make a little extra money to make the next batch of beer, for free. But that led to a series of bigger and bigger questions about what's happening within the food system, and eventually the formation of this company. But it was really started from this hobby of making beer as a college student, and then making bread from the grain that was left behind from that, and selling that bread to buy the ingredients to make more beer for free.
So take me back, because at some point, and I'm always interested in mission and focus, and there's so many things our brain processes on a daily basis. We ultimately have to decide what's going to get in the funnel into our active dream loop, if you will.
Sure.
When you first started noticing that you had this extra barley, you had this extra product, that from your perspective, it was a bathtub's worth of beer and a pound of barley, or whatever the case may be. Walk me through how that evolved to, oh, well, maybe we can sell this or make it into something else, to figuring out that maybe knowingly or unknowingly, you're kind of chipping away at one of the biggest problems in the world. And at what point did you feel this is a mission that I can embrace with some passion to go after? Because the most successful people in the world aren't necessarily the people that got the greatest grades in school. They're the folks that have found a mission, a passion, where they can really alter kind of the arc of how we all live and engage. I'm really interested in how that evolved.
Yeah, I love that question, Gary. And I think of passion often, and think of it as a emotional currency, if you will, that is actually required for you, as an input, somewhere that you're investing your time to have. And for me, so just to put some numbers around it, it was about 1 pound of grain for every 6-pack of beer. The average batch size I was making was about 5 gallons of beer. That's like a third of a commercial keg. So I'd be using 30 pounds of barley, every week to make the beer, which doesn't sound like a lot, but if you think about, a 5-pound bag of flour, you buy from a grocery store, right? It's significantly more than that. Every time you're making a batch of beer. And so, like any good inquisitive mind, I did some research. I thought, hey, I can't be the first person to wonder what to do with this material. I looked for some insights and inspiration elsewhere, and I found a fascinating and rich history of human consumption, around this material. I mean, there's evidence of beer making going back to when humans stopped being nomadic and started, actually working the land and settling, and the bakers all say it was bread, the brewers all say it was beer, that anchored our kind of social evolution in that way. But and then there was evidence of bread making from grains from that had been used in beer production, going back to Mesopotamia, ancient Mesopotamia, more recently in the Middle Ages, in modern day Germany. And there was also brew pubs and small examples of for example, a brewery down the street from you, maybe in Vale, making a pizza crust or something, with the grains from brewing. And another example I remember being really inspired by was the brewery Dogfish Head, and they're out east, and in their restaurant they had a menu item that was a burger where the cattle were raised on being fed this barley from so-called brewer's spent grain is the technical term for it, but we like to say it's not spent, it's super. And this burger was raised on the cows were raised on the brewer's grain, and it was served on a bun that was made with the brewer's grain. I thought, hey, if I can figure out how to make beer, I can probably figure out how to make bread. So that was kind of the initial light bulb on it. And at the time, there weren't really great statistics about the global food waste problem. A lot of those numbers started coming forward. 2012, 2014 was a pretty landmark report by the National Research Defense Council called Wasted. At the time, it just felt like common sense. Hey, we could be doing better, and was inspired by sustainable business models and something called Cradle to Cradle, which is a book by a famous sustainability scholar named Bill McDonough, and others, where it was seeing where there's patterns that were being done, but like wondering, kind of really scratching my head, like why this wasn't happening yet with brewing, why there was no products made that I could find on the local grocery store that were made, using this really nutritious, really delicious, really versatile material that I knew firsthand, could be done with more. Like, why isn't this already a thing? And so the next step was trying to figure out the answer to those questions.
You're finding pushback from kind of the traditional suppliers of, like Pepperidge Farm, wherever they're buying their flour or whatever their baseline ingredients are. Who are your competitors in the traditional space?
Yeah, so this is the SuperGrain Plus. The ingredient we make it's pretty unique. It's about 30% protein by weight, which is significantly more than a conventional flour. But it's a different type of protein, so it's different properties when you make a dough, for example, which we can talk about. But also the fiber profile. It's really rich in dietary fiber, and so we're typically selling this ingredient into new product development opportunities, new types of bread, new types of pretzels and pastas and other grain-based foods, where it's really like a fortifying inclusion, not a substitute for a conventional commodity flour. But we're of course not the only ones out there with interesting new ingredients that are competing for the attention of the bigger food companies. But it's not it's not that we're saying, hey, you are currently buying bread flour, you're going to buy this instead. We're a part of the blend to make a product that is, if you think of like when quinoa started showing up in different places, maybe that's a good example, where there's a new type of product and a new story to tell. We are providing that platform, if you will, to food brands and the manufacturers who support them and the retailers and food service operators who carry those products.
How do you do distribution? How do you find new markets?
Yeah, we're more interested in the nuts and bolts of the distribution answer, which is not too different from other just physical economy, products of what we have, warehousing and trucks that go to customers, right? But it's the sales model, which is a triangle, with our customers. So we're often working with a lot of the brand. If you walk down the grocery store and point to different brands, first of all, a lot of them are the same company, right? But even the ones that are independently owned, very few of them are actually manufacturing their own products. So for a product to be like on a grocery store shelf, there's what's a contract manufacturer, or a co-man, is the jargon in the industry, that typically produces the products. And so we're working in a triangle typically with the co-man and the brand. starting with the brand, helping them understand what they can do with this new product, how it serves their goals, as a company, the consumer demand that they're looking to tap into. Maybe it's around GLP-1 friendly snacking, or keto was a big one, a couple of years ago, or maybe more sustainable product positioning. But then ultimately our transaction happens with their manufacturer, who sources our ingredient along with the other ingredients and produces the finished good. And so we're in a bit of an innovation triangle, if you can think of it like that, to get our products from being a great idea to being, a great product that someone like you could walk into the grocery store and buy.
How have you handled the growth of your company? I mean, as far as your funding goes to develop it, have you done seed rounds or A rounds or venture capital? How have you funded this so far?
Yeah, very non-traditionally. So we did a little bit of an initial angel round that was pretty conservative. But we were early on with rewards-based crowdfunding as well, which was basically a pre-sale campaign. We were initially trying to fund the company through cash flows from our own consumer products that we would make using our own ingredients. So use that as a vehicle to educate the market about what we were doing, and then also generate revenue and what we hoped profit, from that could fund the growth, relying on less external capital. But at a certain point, we needed to commercialize the machinery that we developed at the USDA, and we required outside investment at a certain point. So rather than pursue traditional venture capital, we did a couple of kind of strange things that I'll articulate. One was that we built upon that idea of the rewards-based crowdfunding campaign and thought, hey, what if we democratized our capital stack here and actually turned our customers into our investors? And this was right around the time that what's now called equity crowdfunding or community rounds were becoming actually possible from just like a securities regulation standpoint. And so we actually did 2 rounds of equity crowdfunding, where we can get into the nuances of this. I know that you've got some background in some of this area, but we did WeFunder is a good example of that. The platform WeFunder, where we have actually now about 1,000 investors, they all get summarized into a line on our cap table, right? But it's done through this kind of strategic platform of getting others to own our mission and our success with us. And then on the other end of that spectrum, we pursued strategic corporate venture capital from companies that have a vested interest in what we're doing. So we brought in some investment from a consumer packaged goods company, Barilla. We brought in Molson Coors actually as a strategic investor. They of course have a vested interest in the blatant supply chain that they have from their brewing process. We got a retailer to make a strategic investment as well. And so we've sort of see if we could align use the jargon, the value chain, so to speak, right?
Sure.
From the field to fork, if I'm being corny.
Yeah, no, I think it was really smart. So you use a recently passed regulation called Reg CF for crowdfunding, which allows you to raise money from non-accredited investors, which opens up the world of your type of companies at a very early stage. On your latter rounds, did you convert your earlier investors to shareholders on a cap table, or were they still holding investments that would ultimately be valued at some later time?
Yeah, so we did have a conversion event. Another strategic investor that we had, led a priced round, and that was a conversion event for the earlier investors who were on a convertible note. And so actually, the first Reg CF raise we did was on a convertible note. The second was following the terms of the priced round, and so it was more structured initially as a follow-on opportunity for the first Reg CF investors. We actually did a parallel raise with a Reg D, at the same time. Don't usually go into this much detail about it, but I know with your background, it's an audience. It's probably interesting. And what was fascinating to us was, the Reg CF opened us up to non-accredited investors, but we actually found some accredited investors through that process, and a couple of them actually came on to join our advisory board, as well. So it was really quite a strategic move. I often, when I'm meeting with other founders who are thinking about how to raise capital, I suggest they think about doing something like a WeFunder, because it really can be quite strategic capital if you position it correctly. It's not just the companies who can't raise through other means raise through there. It can be a strategic choice to democratize the ownership of your company, and you never know who you're going to meet through that process and how important they'll be to the next phase of the company.
what's resonating with me right now is you never knew when you were brewing that beer and you had all the extra stuff left over that you were going to form a company out of it, but you saw an opportunity. You started to think it through and say, if I can do A and B, maybe I can get to C. And then you're at D, E, and F, and it's like, okay, so this is a smart way to raise it because everybody should have an interest in what you're doing as human beings. But all of a sudden, you find you're aligned pretty well with a lot of your investors who are able to do a Reg D contribution. I think it's really smart the way you did it because everything you did was built on a solid foundation from what you did before, including deciding you didn't want to pay for beer in college. I think it's great. It's brilliant.
Thanks, Gary. And I
Any,
think it's, sometimes I think about, I know you're mentioning before we started recording that you do some ski instruction, as well. And
yeah.
I often find metaphor in recreation, including skiing, myself. And I think often about the parallels between being on a chairlift on the way up and looking at the face of the mountain, maybe a chute you want to hit or something like that. But then when you're actually skiing, you can only see so far in front of you, right? And you're making real-time decisions. And so it's kind of this balance of, having an idea of what steps might unlock the next, but also just staying open to what the run is going to present you, and then trying to make as good decisions as you can along the way, knowing what you know when you know it, which is
Well,
often the hard part.
you bring up a really
Yeah.
other interesting point. My background in financial advisory and also training financial advisors for over half my career, now consulting with mostly guys of my vintage. Um, when I'm talking with these people, they're incredibly successful. They've built great practices and they know there's an issue, but I'll try and dig into the issue and there's an immediate fear that I have to walk them through. I translate that to skiing. I've got someone that is terrified of skiing bumps. They hate them. They're good skiers, but they hate bumps. So they're successful in their own right, but they have this inherent fear. So instead, just as you said, well, let's go over here. There's some modest bumps and let's just think about our turns. So we walk them through, and I literally sometimes will take my skis off and walk through the bump. And all of a sudden, they're like 4 bumps in because that's all they're thinking about. I said, well, why don't you see if you can get 5 more? And by the time they get to the bottom, they're like, oh my God, I love this. So it's similar that you look forward, you make your decisions going forward and not be so paralyzed by the fear of what might change. I think sometimes our problem is if we're successful in other realms, we figure we can just jump into something new and we're going to master it right away. And I can tell you, I was a decent skier, but it's taken me a fairly significant amount of effort to become a decent ski instructor. They're very different between the two. So I read you loud and clear. This is really fascinating, Dan. Anything else you want to add that you want folks to know?
I mean, I think you hit on something that I often also find myself thinking about, which is how often people are, I don't know if it's always fear, but I'll characterize it as fear in this of just taking action on their ideas. It's the hardest part for a lot of great concepts is actually going from concept into action. And I really believe that it's possible to break down a concrete set of based on what at a given moment, what you can do to move something forward. And it's okay to take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. That's actually really solid work if you're pursuing something entrepreneurial. A lot of times it feels like 2 forward, 2 back, or 2 forward,
Yeah.
4 back, and you still go. But like it's then you can find moments of flow with momentum, right, where you actually feel like you're making the progress. But a lot of people never actually take action on their ideas in the first place for a variety of reasons. So
I would add one thing to
yeah.
that, and I think you're a great example of it. One of the things I always talk about is when you're thinking about where you want to head, for instance, in a financial advisory career, I set completely irrational and insane goals at a very early period in time. I had no idea how I was going to get there, but I found out later it didn't matter. As long as that goal was important to me, I could figure out what that next move would be. Where's the next turn?
Mm-hmm.
What's the next iteration I've got to do? And I think you've got to share a lot of that approach based on how you had a vision of where this could go. And then you start to iterate into it. And all of a sudden you look back and you say, well, wow, look at all these discrete things I have accomplished relative to this vision I had no idea how I was going to get to. That's the fun part of this. And I think anybody can do it, but they've got to have the ability, I think, to really take a chance with their imagination and not be
Yeah.
afraid of falling short. Even if you fall short on something like that, you still get a hell of a lot further than you would have otherwise.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that brings me to a quote that sums this up nicely, I think, which is around So my favorite definition of innovation, which is that innovation is putting creativity into action, right? So it's got to put it into action, got to take the step, and in doing so, ask for help. You're not alone. Find a ski instructor,
Dan, this has been great. Thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate it. I wish you the best of luck with your company. I'm going to put this on a couple of my alerts and follow along, but I love your idea. And I think you're headed for great things. Thanks again for joining us today on If the Public Only Knew. Take good care.
Take care.
Thanks for checking out If the Public Only Knew with Gary Cinderbrandt. If you found today's episode helpful, be sure to follow the show and share it with another advisor, investor, or friend. For more on Gary, or to check out any links mentioned in the episode, head to the show notes. We'll see you next time.